SEGA Smash Pack Volume 1 was released on the SEGA Dreamcast on January 31st, 2001. Or rather, it began being packed in with Dreamcasts around the time. Despite being the supposed first and only volume on the console, it's actually the third SEGA Smash Pack, following Volumes 1 and 2 on the PC, released a few years prior. Smash Pack is fairly unremarkable on the surface. Despite it being on the fancy Dreamcast at the time, the Sega Genesis titles, which make up for 8 of the 10 games, don't run particularly great, with various sound bugs and slowdown not present on the original system. The Dreamcast was completely discontinued just 2 months later, on March 31st, 2001, making the Sega Smash Pack one of the last handful of games that would be released on the system. Throughout the Dreamcast's life, a pirate hacker group by the name of Echelon had been dumping a ton of Dreamcast games onto the internet, 188 to be exact, so anyone with the know-how could download them, burn them to a disc, and play these games for free. This, of course, was for the most dedicated of dedicated, as we're talking the days of dial-up, and downloading a Dreamcast game on a standard connection at the time would have taken days. Nonetheless, Echelon had a pretty hardcore following, and each time they released a game, they made plenty of fanfare about it. Sega Smash Pack, of course, was no exception to the group. But on February 3rd, 2001, a mere 4 days after the game's release, Echelon had found something far more exciting than their normal Dreamcast game. As it turns out, Sega Smash Pack contained a Sega Genesis emulator, and Echelon had discovered a way to load custom Genesis games onto it. Among the release notes included with Smash Pack's drop was an odd line at the very bottom. "Regards to Uncle Sonic for his help, you know for what." It was not of the ordinary to give a shout out to others in the community. Groups, Echelon included, did this all the time. Thus, most people didn't think much of it, seeing as they now had a second system in their current one. The group released their ROM loader a few days later, which caused a ruckus among the scene, and we'll touch on that in a moment. Fast forward to May 21st, 2008. The owner of DC Emulation, a site dedicated to Dreamcast preservation and emulation, has made a discovery. While dumping Dreamcast games to add them to a database for a project, the owner, going by the name Dark, finds a text file in the original untouched and unmodified Sega Smash Pack game on the Dreamcast. The text file has one word, in all caps, Echelon. The text file contains a detailed summary of how the emulator for the Sega Genesis titles work, starting with, "To whomever releases this pack." There's information about the file formats, how the system's region lock is replicated, how to make the games run, and even parameters to adjust for various games on the system. But most interesting of all is the last words. And don't forget to pay your respects to Uncle Sonic. Sony just doesn't get it. Gary. With Uncle Sonic now having some context, Echelon's last line in their release notes made sense. They hadn't actually found out any of this information on their own, but rather it was all nice and neatly handed to them in the disc itself. The ROM loader the group put out caused a stir for a multitude of reasons, the biggest being the legality of it. The Dreamcast is well known for its extensive homebrew scene, which still sees releases today. Smaller indie groups have released their own games, full discs, manuals, the whole 9 yards on the Dreamcast because it's so simple. Without getting overly technical, the Dreamcast has a special disk drive called the GD-ROM. The idea was that this format would defeat piracy since CD burning technology became more and more available, while still being cheaper than using DVDs. The problem is that the Dreamcast could still take CDs, so hacker groups like Echelon found ways to burn the games onto a CD and thus allowed the floodgates for piracy to fly open. So after years of slow and buggy attempts to get Genesis games running on the Dreamcast, the now renamed emulator, dubbed SegaGen, was released to the wild. But it was found shortly thereafter that it was merely using Sega Smash Pack and wasn't actually an emulator someone had wrote from scratch. Sites stopped hosting it, and it caused a rather substantial rift in the community. So who exactly is this Gary fellow anyway? Well, as it turns out, Gary is none other than the programmer of Sega Smash Pack, Gary Lake. Gary Lake worked on several Sega titles, with the Sega Smash Pack being his last. As you can already tell, Mr. Lake wrote this text knowing full well that Echelon were among the only people who would find his message before unleashing it upon the world. But even better is the line about Sony, how they just don't get it. Gary Lake was well aware that the Dreamcast time was almost at its end, and he wasn't far off either. January 31st, 2001 is the same day Sega announced that they would be discontinuing the production of the Dreamcast entirely. And as a result, he wrote a back-end so players could still have something to play on their systems when it came to its untimely demise. Gary Lake is still active in the industry today. He's worked in a little bit of everywhere, it seems, from EA, Midway, Capcom, Universal, and most recently with Warner Brothers and NetherRealms on the new Mortal Kombat 11 game. And while he's had his hands in all sorts of pots, his legacy may very well be the programmer that let the Dreamcast go out with a bang. Hey folks, Expansion Pack is my new series that's going to be focusing on gaming history and think pieces rather than just outright reviews. You can check out these old videos here to get an idea of what the future will hold for the channel, and, well, enjoy!